There's a building that used to be a Toys R Us in almost every mid-sized city in America. Some of them are stick sporting goods stores now, or empty lots, or parking spaces nobody thinks twice about. But if you grew up anywhere in this country between about 1975 and 2015, there's a good chance a store just like it is burned into your memory. The giant red letters, the giraffe out front, the smell of that store the second you walked through the doors. I want to tell you the story of how this company went from an absolute juggernaut, a company that, at its peak, ran over 1,600 stores, pulled in more than $13 billion a year, and controlled something like a quarter of the entire American toy market, to a company that, in the space of about 2 decades, collapsed into bankruptcy and put 33,000 people out of work almost overnight. This isn't really a story about toys. It's a story about debt, about timing, about what happens when a genuinely good business gets handed a genuinely bad hand. Stick around, because the ending of this one is more devastating than you'd expect. Quick intro if you're new here. I make videos about the rise and fall of businesses, brands, and the decisions behind them. If that's your kind of thing, I've pulled the biggest lessons from all these stories into one free document. Links down in the description and pinned in the comments. Go grab it, and if you're enjoying this one, drop a follow and a comment. I read every single one, and honestly, it makes my day. Alright, let's get into it. Our story starts right after World War II. America in the late 1940s is in the middle of what we now call the baby boom. Soldiers are coming home, families are forming at a pace the country has never seen before, and there is a sudden, massive wave of new parents who need stuff. Furniture, clothes, cribs, all of it. A 25-year-old named Charles Lazarus noticed this. He wasn't a toy guy at first. He opened a small store in Washington, D.C., selling baby furniture, cribs, changing tables, that sort of thing. And when you run a tiny store like that yourself, you're doing everything. You're the buyer, the cashier, the guy sweeping the floor at closing, which means you're also the one standing there listening to every single customer complaint and request. And the thing customers kept asking Lazarus for wasn't more furniture, it was toys. Parents were coming in to buy a crib and asking, almost as an afterthought, "Do you sell toys too?" Lazarus listened. In 1957, he rebranded and opened the first Toys R Us, with that now famous backwards R, as a completely different kind of store. This wasn't a toy aisle bolted onto a department store, and it wasn't a cramped specialty shop with a few hundred items behind a counter. This was one of the very first category killer concepts in American retail, an absolutely massive selection, laid out supermarket style, where a kid could walk in and see basically every toy that existed in one building. It sounds obvious now, because every big box store in existence today copied this idea. Back then, it was radical. Think about what grocery store-style toy shopping actually meant in 1957. Before this, if you wanted to buy a toy, you generally went to a department store and dealt with a single glass display case, or a small specialty shop with maybe a couple hundred items total, usually kept behind a counter so a clerk had to fetch things for you. You didn't really browse. You asked, and somebody handed you what they had in stock. Lazarus flipped that completely. He put the inventory out on open shelves, let kids and parents wander the aisles themselves, and stocked an almost absurd breadth of selection. The whole appeal of the store was that if a toy existed anywhere in America, there was a real chance you could find it here, under one roof, without driving to 3 different stores. That's the category killer idea in a nutshell. Instead of being one of several decent options in a category, you become the only serious option, because nobody else can match your depth of selection. It's the exact same playbook Home Depot would later use for hardware, and Best Buy would later use for electronics. Toys R Us basically got there first. Here's the thing about Toys R Us. It opened at exactly the right moment in American history. The 1960s, 70s, and 80s were the golden age of the category killer. Suburbs were expanding. Families had cars and disposable income. And there was no competition for attention the way there is today. No internet, no smartphones, no on-demand anything. If a kid wanted an afternoon out, or a parent wanted to keep them entertained on a Saturday, you got in the car and you went somewhere. I remember being a kid in the 80s and 90s, and when I got bored, my version of going somewhere was begging my mum to drop me off at a Borders or a Barnes & Noble so I could sit in the air conditioning and read comic books for 3 hours. It sounds almost quaint now, but that was the entertainment landscape, physical destinations you drove to, because there wasn't anything else. Toys R Us rode this wave incredibly hard. Within about 20 years of opening that first store, they'd expanded to well over 1,000 locations. And a few other things were working heavily in their favor. First, birth rates. People were simply having more kids in the 70s and 80s than they are today. By some estimates, the birth rate per woman back then was 20 to 25% higher than it is now. More kids means more toy customers. Second, television advertising was king, and Toys R Us understood this better than almost anyone. If you were a kid in that era, you knew the jingle.
I'm a Toys R Us kid.
It played during Saturday morning cartoons. It played during after-school reruns. It was everywhere. And it worked. At its peak, Toys R Us reportedly had somewhere around 98% brand recognition in the United States. Not most people had heard of it. 98% of Americans, shown the logo, could tell you exactly what the store sold. That is an almost unheard of level of market penetration for any brand, in any category, ever. And because they controlled so much of the toy market, again, somewhere around a quarter of all toy sales in the country flowed through their stores, Toys R Us had enormous leverage over suppliers. If you were a toy manufacturer and Toys R Us decided to push your product, you had a hit on your hands. Cabbage Patch Kids, Tickle Me Elmo. These weren't just popular toys that happened to sell well. Toys R Us's shelf space and promotional muscle helped manufacture those crazes in the first place. Get in good with Toys R Us, and they could make your toy the must-have item of the holiday season. Get on their bad side and good luck. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to underestimate just how much power that represents. When one retailer controls a quarter of an entire product category, they're not just a customer to manufacturers anymore. They're basically a gatekeeper. A toy company could spend a fortune designing, manufacturing, and marketing a new product, and if Toys R Us decided not to give it good shelf placement, or decided not to feature it in their holiday catalog, that product could quietly die on the vine, no matter how good it was. Conversely, if Toys R Us put a toy front and center during the holiday rush, demand could spike overnight into the kind of nationwide shortage where parents were literally lining up before dawn, or paying scalpers just to get their hands on one. That kind of leverage doesn't just help a business, it makes the business the tastemaker for an entire industry. By 1994, when Charles Lazarus stepped down, the company was sitting at the absolute peak of its power. And it wasn't alone. This was the golden era for category killers generally. Borders and Barnes & Noble were doing the same thing in books. Home Depot was doing it in hardware. If you were a small, independent competitor trying to go up against one of these giants, you simply couldn't. The economics of scale were brutal, and the big box players used every advantage they had. But right around the moment a company looks completely unbeatable is usually right around the moment the ground starts shifting underneath it. The first real crack came from a direction Toys R Us probably should have seen coming, but didn't fully appreciate until it was already a problem: the discounters. Here's something people don't always realize. The typical Walmart or Target store in the 1980s and early 90s was roughly half the physical size of what those stores look like today. They simply didn't have the floor space to carry a deep toy selection. But through the 90s, both chains dramatically expanded their store footprints, and suddenly they had room for entire toy sections that hadn't existed before. This mattered enormously because of a very simple, very human piece of shopping behavior. Mom is already at Walmart or Target, buying groceries, cleaning supplies, and clothes for the kids. Dragging a couple of children to a separate store, in a separate parking lot, just for toys, is a hassle nobody wants if they don't have to. So when Walmart and Target started stocking the best-selling 70 or 80% of toys, the stuff that actually moves, at rock-bottom prices, as basically a loss leader to get people in the door, Toys R Us lost its core advantage. It was no longer the only game in town, and it definitely wasn't the most convenient option anymore. To their credit, Toys R Us wasn't blind to this. They leaned harder into being an experience. Bigger in-store displays, exclusive product launches, bigger promotional events, the works. Make the kids beg to go there instead of just Target. And for a while, it helped soften the blow. But there's a structural problem with competing on experience against a discounter. Experience costs money, and price is the one thing a discounter can always win on if it decides to. Walmart and Target weren't trying to outfund Toys R Us. They didn't need to. They just needed to be good enough, and cheap enough, and already on the way to peel off enough of the price-sensitive middle of the market. And that's exactly what they did. Toys R Us didn't lose its most devoted customers. The parents who wanted the full selection and the full experience still came. What it slowly lost was the casual, convenience-driven majority of shoppers, the ones who just needed to grab a birthday present on the way home from the grocery store. That's a much bigger slice of the market than it sounds like, and once it started eroding, it never really came back. But a much bigger storm was forming on the horizon, and this one Toys R Us handled about as badly as a company possibly could. By the late 1990s, e-commerce was starting to emerge as a real threat, not just to Toys R Us, but to physical retailers of every kind. Book chains were feeling it. Toy chains were feeling it. And a young company called Amazon, which had started as an online bookstore, was actively looking for ways to expand into new categories. Toys R Us saw the internet coming. They weren't asleep at the wheel on that front. But when it came time to actually respond, they made what may be one of the single worst strategic decisions in modern retail history. In the early 2000s, Toys R Us signed a deal with Amazon. Under the arrangement, Amazon paid Toys R Us roughly $50 million a year for the right to be the exclusive online provider of toys sold through Toys R Us's web presence. On paper, this probably sounded reasonable to executives at the time. A guaranteed payment, plus access to Amazon's growing customer base and technical infrastructure, without Toys R Us having to build a serious e-commerce operation of its own from scratch. In practice, it handed Amazon exactly what it needed to become the dominant online toy retailer in America, using Toys R Us's own catalog and reputation as the springboard. And then Amazon did what companies fighting for market dominance tend to do. They started bringing in other toy suppliers and vendors outside the terms of the exclusivity agreement, essentially breaking the spirit of the deal while technically maneuvering around it. Toys R Us eventually sued over this, and years later won a judgment. But by then, the damage was done. Amazon had used those years to build out a toy business of its own, powered in part by the very infrastructure and trust Toys R Us had handed it. Now, it's easy to look back with 2 decades of hindsight and call this an obviously terrible decision. But put yourself in the room in the early 2000s. Nobody knew for certain what e-commerce was actually going to look like in 10 or 20 years. Was it going to be one dominant everything store? Was it going to be a fragmented landscape of specialty online retailers? Was physical retail even going to be seriously threatened at all? Or was this internet thing a passing fad, the way some skeptics insisted at the time? For a company that had built its entire identity and infrastructure around physical, in-your-face retail, it's not hard to understand why the leadership at Toys R Us got this one wrong. They weren't stupid. They were navigating genuine uncertainty and made a bet that, in retrospect, was catastrophic. Whatever the reasoning, the outcome was brutal. Every year that passed made it easier and easier for a parent to just click a button and have a toy show up at the front door a day or two later, no trip to the store required at all. And Toys R Us had, in effect, helped train an entire generation of parents to do exactly that, through Amazon, not through Toys R Us's own website. This is a pattern you'll see again and again in stories about companies getting disrupted. It's not that the leadership ignores the threat. Almost every company facing disruption does something in response. The problem is that the something is often shaped by short-term incentives, institutional caution, and a hired executive's understandable reluctance to bet the entire company and everyone's jobs, including their own, on a radical strategic pivot. Charles Lazarus had retired. The professional managers who followed him were, quite reasonably, more inclined to hedge than to gamble. If the Amazon deal was the first domino, what happened next is the one that actually determined how this story ends. By 2005, growth had stalled. E-commerce and the discounters were both eating into market share, and shareholders were getting restless. So a trio of private equity firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust, stepped in and took the company private in a leveraged buyout worth about $6.6 billion. Here's the part that matters most. Of that $6.6 billion, the private equity firms themselves put up a little over $1 billion in actual equity, their own cash. The rest, more than $5 billion, was financed through debt that was loaded directly onto Toys R Us's own balance sheet. This is the classic structure of a leveraged buyout. The acquiring firms use comparatively little of their own money, and instead have the target company itself borrow the bulk of the purchase price, with the target company then responsible for paying that debt back. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what debt actually does to a business. When a company is growing and healthy, a reasonable debt load is a completely normal, even useful tool. It lets you expand faster than you could using only your own cash. But debt doesn't care whether your industry is thriving or dying. The interest payments come due either way, and Toys R Us, at exactly the moment it took on more than $5 billion in debt, was facing e-commerce disruption, discount store competition, and a shrinking pool of children being born. In other words, about the worst possible timing imaginable to load a company up with fixed, non-negotiable obligations. To put a number on it, Toys R Us was on the hook for something like $400 million a year, every year, just to cover interest payments on that debt, before a single dollar went toward actually running or improving the business. Some analysts at the time estimated the company would have needed to open roughly 40 new stores a year just to keep pace with the growth in its debt load. 40 new stores a year in an era when its core categories were already shrinking. That's not a business plan. That's running in place on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. To make that number feel real, imagine your household takes on a mortgage that costs you $400 a month, and your income is stable, maybe even growing a little. Manageable. Now imagine that same $400 a month payment, except your hours at work just got cut, Your industry is shrinking, and a couple of competitors just opened up down the street, selling the exact same thing you sell for less. The payment hasn't changed. Your ability to pay it just fell off a cliff. That's essentially what happened to Toys R Us at a corporate scale, except instead of one household budget, it was hundreds of stores, tens of thousands of employees, and a supplier network, all depending on the company staying solvent. And this is the part that a lot of people miss when they hear private equity buyout and assume it automatically means asset stripping or mismanagement. That's not really what happened here. The debt itself wasn't necessarily an insane bet at the moment it was made. Leveraged buyouts happen across healthy, stable industries all the time, and plenty of them work out fine for everyone involved. The problem was that Toys R Us wasn't a stable, boring business anymore by 2005. It was already a business under real competitive pressure from two different directions at once, right as it took on the kind of debt load that only makes sense for a business with predictable, growing cash flow. The timing, more than the debt itself, is what turned a normal financial maneuver into a slow-motion structural failure. Here's what makes this part of the story genuinely tragic rather than simply a story of corporate incompetence. The business, underneath all of this, was actually run pretty well during these years. In 2006, the company brought in Gerald Storch, a former Target executive, as CEO. Storch closed underperforming stores, sharpened promotions, and generally ran a tighter, smarter operation than the one he inherited. By most accounts from analysts and former employees, he did a genuinely good job navigating a difficult environment. After Storch, Dave Brandon, who had previously run Domino's Pizza, took over and continued modernizing the company. He pushed hard into loyalty programs and digital initiatives. At one point, close to 30% of the company's traffic was reportedly tied to loyalty program engagement. These are exactly the kinds of moves a smart, forward-looking retailer should be making in the face of disruption. This is the actual thesis of this whole story, and it's worth saying plainly, Toys R Us was not destroyed by bad management. It was destroyed by bad capital structure. Good operators were running the business reasonably well underneath a debt load that had been forced onto it by a financial transaction that had nothing to do with selling toys. Every dollar of cash flow that could have gone toward modernizing stores, competing on price, building out real e-commerce, or investing in the loyalty programs that were clearly starting to work, instead went straight out the door as interest payments to bondholders. As if a $5 billion debt load, an e-commerce giant eating your lunch, and discount stores undercutting your prices weren't enough. A fourth, completely unrelated headwind showed up in this same stretch of years: the rise of the tablet. Think about what a device like an iPad represents to a parent. For roughly $200 to $300, a one-time purchase, you get access to what is effectively an infinite toy box. Games, videos, educational apps, all of it, updating constantly, at no additional marginal cost per use. Compare that to spending $50 on a physical Lego set or a plastic action figure that a kid might genuinely enjoy for a few afternoons before it ends up in a bin in the closet. This isn't a hypothetical threat. It's something you can observe directly. Walk into pretty much any family restaurant today and count how many toddlers are being kept calm through dinner by a tablet propped up against a water glass. That's not a coincidence. It's a reflection of just how deeply tablets have embedded themselves as the default entertainment and pacification device for an entire generation of kids. Every dollar and every hour a kid spends, absorbed in a tablet, is a dollar and an hour that used to, at least partially, flow toward physical toys. So by around 2016 and 2017, Toys R Us is facing an almost absurd pile-up of simultaneous problems: declining birth rates shrinking its core customer base, e-commerce, much of it powered by the very infrastructure Toys R Us helped build for Amazon, siphoning off sales, discount retailers undercutting its prices on the best-selling items, tablets and digital entertainment eating into overall toy spending, and, underneath all of it, a private equity-imposed debt load requiring roughly $400 million a year just to service, on a business that could barely spare the cash flow. This is the part of the story that's important to sit with for a second. None of these problems, on their own, would have killed Toys R Us. Plenty of retailers have survived rising e-commerce competition. Plenty have survived discount store pressure. Plenty have adapted to shifting entertainment habits among kids. What Toys R Us couldn't survive was facing all of that at the same time, while also having no financial flexibility left to respond to any of it. Because every spare dollar was already spoken for by interest payments on debt that had nothing to do with actually running the business. This is where things move fast, and where the ending everyone remembers actually happens. By September of 2017, investors and analysts were closely watching just how much of the company's cash flow was being consumed by debt service, and rumors began circulating that Toys R Us might be preparing to file for bankruptcy. If you understand how the retail calendar works, you know that September is possibly the worst month imaginable for this kind of news to leak. September is peak stocking up season, the exact window when retailers place their biggest orders with suppliers to build up inventory ahead of the holiday shopping season. The moment word got out that bankruptcy might be on the table, suppliers panicked, and reasonably so. If you're a toy manufacturer and there's a real chance the retailer you're shipping millions of dollars of merchandise to might not be able to pay you once it enters bankruptcy proceedings, you stop shipping. That's exactly what happened. Suppliers pulled back, and Toys R Us's shelves, right before the most important selling season of the entire year, started running thin. Black Friday is called Black Friday because it's traditionally the day retailers cross over from being in the red for the year to being in the black, profitable. If you don't have merchandise to sell going into that critical stretch between Thanksgiving and Christmas, the odds of having a profitable holiday season, and by extension a profitable year, collapse. And that is essentially what happened to Toys R Us. The looming bankruptcy fears became something close to a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fear of bankruptcy caused the supply disruptions that made bankruptcy far more likely. Toys R Us did formally file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in September of 2017 and secured a roughly $2 billion loan intended to help the company limp through the critical holiday season and reorganize. But with thin shelves, spooked suppliers, and spooked customers who'd heard the bankruptcy news, the holiday season was largely a bust. And once a retailer misses its most important selling window of the year while also carrying an unsustainable debt load, there often isn't a path back. In March of 2018, Toys R Us announced it would be liquidating entirely, closing every remaining US store, walking away from its leases, and selling off its remaining assets. Roughly 33,000 people lost their jobs, many of them long-time employees who'd built careers at the company. And then comes the detail that makes this story land the way it does. Charles Lazarus, the man who, 70 years earlier, had listened to parents asking for toys instead of furniture and built an entire category of American retail out of that observation, passed away just 1 week after the liquidation was finalized. He was 94 years old and, by most accounts, had been in poor health for some time, so the timing was almost certainly coincidental. But it's hard not to feel the weight of it, the founder's life and his company's life ending within days of each other, as though the business genuinely was, in some sense, an extension of the man who built it. Here's what I keep coming back to with this story. Toys R Us, as a retail business, was fundamentally fine. People still have kids. Kids still want toys. Even with e-commerce, even with tablets, even with Walmart and Target undercutting on price, there was still a real sustainable business in there somewhere, one capable of adapting, the way Gerald Storch and Dave Brandon were actually managing to do, slowly, store by store, promotion by promotion, loyalty program by loyalty program. What killed Toys R Us wasn't bad toys, bad stores, or bad management. It was debt, a huge, unforgiving pile of it, strapped onto the company at exactly the wrong moment in its history, for reasons that had far more to do with a private equity transaction in 2005 than with anything happening on the sales floor. Debt is a two-edged sword. Used well, in the right conditions, it lets a business grow faster than it otherwise could. Used at the wrong moment, on a business already facing real headwinds, it becomes the very thing that wipes everything out, right when the company needs flexibility the most. There's also a broader lesson here that goes beyond just this one company, and it's why I think this story keeps getting told years later. We tend to want a clean villain in these corporate collapse stories, a greedy executive, an obviously bad product, a founder who lost the plot. It's a satisfying narrative because it's simple and it implies the failure was avoidable if only someone had made better decisions in the room. The Toys R Us story doesn't give you that. The people running the day-to-day business, for the most part, were making reasonable, even smart decisions given what they knew at the time. The real culprit is something much less cinematic, a balance sheet decision made a decade earlier by people who weren't in the store, weren't dealing with customers, and had largely moved on by the time the bill came due. So that's the story of Toys R Us. From a young man listening to New Parents in 1948 to 98% brand recognition and a quarter of the American toy market to a liquidation that happened in the end almost as fast as the rise itself. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think this one was avoidable, or was Toys R Us always doomed the moment private equity took over in 2005? Would you have made the Amazon deal in 2000 knowing what everyone knew back then, or is that hindsight talking? I read every comment, so let me know your take. And honestly, I miss this place. I never got to take my own kids there, and that's a small, weird loss that a lot of people my age carry around. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.